My parents handed my reserved wedding venue to my brother, saying his guests matter more. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply watched my mother slide the booking contract across the dining table as though she were discussing the weather, instead of dismantling the most important day of my life. The room smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood. My father's fingers tapped impatiently against his mug while my brother leaned back with the smug confidence of someone who had never once been told no. My fiancée sat beside me in complete silence, squeezing my hand beneath the table hard enough to remind me I wasn't alone. "It's only practical," my father said. "Your brother's business partners are attending. His wedding needs the better venue." I had reserved that estate 14 months earlier. I had paid every deposit myself, every centerpiece, every menu tasting. Every floor plan had been chosen after months of planning. My mother didn't even apologize. "You're adaptable," she said. "He needs this more." In that moment, I realized they weren't asking for my understanding. They were expecting my surrender. So I smiled, not because I accepted their decision, because I had just stopped trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided my happiness was negotiable. No one noticed the calm in my voice when I quietly replied, "If that's what you want." They mistook silence for defeat. They celebrated around the table before I had even left the house. I could hear my brother laughing as he discussed guest lists and champagne towers while I walked to my car carrying the folder that contained every receipt from the wedding they had just stolen. I sat behind the steering wheel, staring through the windshield until the tears stopped on their own. Then I started the engine. By the time my father received my new wedding invitation 3 weeks later, he called me 14 times before lunch. I answered none of them, because by then, the wedding they thought they had taken from me no longer existed. It had become something they could never imitate, never control, and never be part of. I wasn't the loud one in my family. I never fought for attention because experience had taught me that raising my voice only gave everyone another reason to ignore what I was saying. Somewhere along the way, I became the dependable child, the one who solved problems instead of creating them. If something needed to be sacrificed, it was usually expected to come from me. My older brother Daniel lived by a different set of rules. He had a talent for turning every occasion into a performance, and our parents adored him for it. His achievements were celebrated with expensive dinners and heartfelt speeches. Mine were acknowledged with polite smiles and reminders to stay humble. I convinced myself for years that it didn't bother me, but disappointments have a way of piling up until they become impossible to ignore. When I graduated with honors, my family left my celebration early because Daniel had a networking event across town. When I bought my first home without asking anyone for financial help, my father joked that I had simply been lucky. Even birthdays somehow became centered around my brother's schedule, as though my life was an appointment that could always be moved. I stopped expecting fairness long before I got engaged. Instead, I built a life that depended on my own effort rather than anyone else's approval. My fiancé Ethan noticed the imbalance almost immediately. He never criticized my parents outright, but he quietly asked questions no one else dared to ask. Why did every compromise seem to come from me? Why was my happiness always treated as negotiable? I never had satisfying answers. Deep down, I still believed that my wedding would be different. I thought one milestone was too important for old family habits to overshadow. I believed my parents would finally see me as someone whose dreams deserved protecting. Instead, they treated the biggest day of my life exactly the way they had treated everything else, as if it belonged to my brother the moment he decided he wanted it. After that conversation, everything changed in ways that were almost too subtle to notice at first. My parents stopped asking about my wedding plans because, in their minds, there were no longer any plans worth discussing. Every phone call somehow drifted back to Daniel's guest list, Daniel's menu, or Daniel's excitement about the beautiful estate that had originally been mine. I listened more than I spoke. One Sunday afternoon, my mother invited me over to look at a few decorations. When I arrived, I recognized my own centerpiece sketches spread across the dining table. The ivory candles, the eucalyptus garlands, even the handwritten notes I'd left during my planning meetings were sitting in front of Daniel and his fiancée. My mother smiled without the slightest hesitation. "They're too lovely to waste," she said, sliding the papers toward them. Daniel barely looked up. "Hope you don't mind. You have great taste." He said it with the casual confidence of someone borrowing a jacket, not taking months of someone else's work. I simply nodded. My silence seemed to reassure them that they had done nothing wrong. The weeks that followed brought more of the same. Relatives called to congratulate Daniel on securing such an elegant venue, never realizing I had been the one who found it. My father laughed during family dinners. proudly telling everyone how fortunate Daniel had been to inherit the reservation. Each time he said the word, his eyes drifted past me as though I were another guest at the table instead of the daughter who had signed every contract. Even Ethan noticed the quiet exchanges. He caught the brief glances my parents shared whenever I entered a room, the awkward pauses before conversations changed direction, and the relieved expressions when I chose not to argue. "They keep waiting for you to explode," he whispered one evening as we walked to the car. I looked back at the warm lights glowing through my parents' windows. "They're waiting for the wrong thing," I said calmly, because while they mistook my silence for surrender, I had already begun making plans they couldn't see. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic argument or a slammed door. It arrived in the form of an envelope. A week after Daniel officially took over the venue, the estate manager mailed me a refund for every deposit I had paid. Tucked inside was a handwritten note thanking me for being the easiest client we've ever worked with and wishing Ethan and me happiness wherever we chose to celebrate. I stared at that note for a long time, not because I was heartbroken anymore, but because it reminded me of something I had forgotten. Every reservation, every payment, every decision had been made by me. My parents hadn't built my wedding. They had simply handed over one location. Nothing else belonged to them. That evening, Ethan spread the refund check, our budget, and a notebook across the kitchen table. Neither of us talked about getting even. We talked about starting over, this time without asking anyone's permission or opinion. As we listed new possibilities, I felt something quietly shift inside me. I wasn't grieving the venue anymore. I was grieving the version of myself that kept believing my family would eventually choose me. That version of me was gone. For the first time, I stopped planning a wedding designed to satisfy everyone else. Instead, I began planning a day that reflected the life Ethan and I were actually building, one where respect wasn't requested. It was expected. And once I accepted that, the perfect venue wasn't the one my brother had taken. It was the one my parents would never have the power to touch. I approached the situation the same way. I handled every major decision in my career with research, patience, and careful planning. As a project manager, I'd spent years negotiating contracts, coordinating vendors, and preparing backup plans for problems no one else expected. Emotions could cloud judgment, but paperwork rarely lied. The first thing I did was review every agreement connected to my original wedding. Since I had signed and paid for everything myself, the cancellations and refunds came directly to me. There were no shared accounts, no family contributions, and no financial strings my parents could pull. Then I started looking beyond the venues everyone in town talked about. Instead of comparing banquet halls, I searched for private estates, historic properties, boutique vineyards, and exclusive locations that hosted only a handful of weddings each year. I wasn't trying to outspend my brother, I was looking for something unforgettable, somewhere chosen for meaning rather than appearances. Ethan handled the guest list while I quietly contacted vendors under strict confidentiality. Every contract included one simple request. No details were to be shared with anyone except the two of us. We even created a separate email address solely for wedding correspondence, ensuring that curious relatives couldn't gather information through casual conversations. Meanwhile, whenever my parents asked whether I had found another place, I smiled politely and answered with the truth. "We're still working on it." They assumed we were struggling because that's the story they expected. In reality, every phone call, every signed contract, and every small decision was bringing us closer to a celebration they knew nothing about. By the time they realized I had never intended to compete with Daniel's wedding, every piece of my plan was already quietly in place. The invitations went out on a quiet Monday morning. They were printed on thick ivory, cardstock with a simple, embossed design and just enough information to tell our guests where to be and when. There were no dramatic announcements, no pointed remarks, and no mention of the venue we had lost. The location spoke for itself. By 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with my father's first call. I watched it ring until it stopped. Then came another. By lunchtime, he had called 14 times. My mother left 2 voice messages asking if the invitations were some kind of mistake. Daniel sent a short text asking how. I had managed to book a place that had a waiting list longer than his engagement. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, Ethan and I drove to the property for our final walkthrough. The gates opened slowly, revealing sweeping gardens, quiet stone paths, and a historic manor overlooking a peaceful lake. Staff members greeted us by name, already arranging flowers exactly as we had requested. Every detail reflected our choices, not anyone else's expectations. For the first time in months, I felt completely at ease. The consequences unfolded without me lifting another finger. Relatives began calling my parents instead of me, wondering why they hadn't mentioned my wedding had been moved to such an extraordinary venue. Family members quietly compared the two celebrations, and the conversation shifted away from Daniel's event almost overnight. I never corrected anyone. I never celebrated their embarrassment. I simply let the truth exist on its own. My parents had taken a building. Without realizing it, they had given me the freedom to create a wedding and a life that no longer revolved around their approval. The wedding itself was everything Ethan and I had hoped for. Peaceful, joyful, and completely free of unnecessary drama. Our guests laughed, explored the gardens, and stayed long after dinner ended, not because of the venue alone, but because the day genuinely felt warm and personal. More than one relative quietly admitted they had never seen me look so relaxed. My parents arrived on time, but something had changed. The confidence they carried for weeks had disappeared. They moved through the reception with careful smiles, realizing that no one was talking about the venue Daniel had received. Instead, people kept complimenting the life Ethan and I had built together and the grace with which we had handled everything. No one confronted my parents. No one needed to. Their own choices had become impossible to ignore. In the months that followed, our relationship settled into a polite distance. They called more often than they used to, but conversations were different now. For the first time, they understood that my silence wasn't weakness. It was a boundary they could no longer cross. I didn't win because my wedding looked better. I won because I stopped measuring my worth by how my family treated me. Sometimes the people who underestimate you expect revenge to arrive, as anger or public humiliation. They prepare for arguments, accusations, and scenes they can defend themselves against. They rarely expect the quiet alternative, a person who walks away, builds something better, and lets success answer every question without saying a single unnecessary word. And that kind of victory lasts far longer than any argument ever could. Years have passed since that wedding, and when I think about it now, I don't remember the venue first. I remember the moment I chose peace over permission. That decision changed far more than a single celebration. It changed the direction of my life. My relationship with my parents never returned to what it had been, but I eventually stopped mourning that loss. Distance gave all of us room to see the truth. They learned that access to my life was no longer automatic. It had to be earned with respect, something they had rarely offered before. Whether they truly understood why didn't matter as much anymore. Ethan and I built the kind of family we had always wanted, one where no child's dreams would ever be measured against someone else's importance. Whenever difficult choices arise, we remind each other that love isn't proven by sacrifice demanded from one person alone. It's proven by fairness, trust, and showing up for the people who count on you. Occasionally, someone still brings up our wedding and comments on how gracefully everything unfolded. They assume I was incredibly lucky. I smile every time. They never see the months of quiet rebuilding behind that single day. The greatest revenge was never making my parents regret what they did. It was creating a life so full of peace, love, and self-respect that their approval became completely irrelevant. Some people believe winning means taking back what was stolen. I learned that real victory comes from building something so much better that you no longer want the thing you lost. And sometimes the most unforgettable answer to betrayal is a smile, a closed door, and a beautiful life waiting on the other side.